interests can put pressure on the on those people that are living under customary tenure regimes. So in this panel, we begin to look at some of the attempts to make land held under customary tenure more secure through the process of formalization. And we've got three great presentations that give us examples of countries that have faced the similar challenges we've been discussing since yesterday, and have tried certain experiments with these. The first presentation by Judith, Kate, and Clemente will give us the case study of Uganda, Malawi, and Mozambique. And then we will have a presentation from Pilani and Chilombo, who will talk to us about how formalization can affect women's rights to land. And we'll finish off with a presentation by Augustine, who's giving us a case study of land titling in Ghana. So as you can see, it's a packed session, and we would like to start promptly, but just a few housekeeping issues. For those joining us online, we ask that you mute and stop your video. For the presenters, please enable your video so you can be seen by the audience. I will shortly also stop my video to allow you the primacy of space to do your presentation. So each presentation we think will last about 15 minutes, and I will give each presenter 5 minutes notice to say you've got 5 minutes to go, and then 2 minutes. So without wasting any more time, I would like to invite Judith, Kate, and Clement to get on with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Admos. I'm just going to share my presentation in just a few minutes. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, both online and offline. My name is Judith Atukunda, and I work with an NGO in Uganda called LandNet, and we do a lot of advocacy on land rights, research, especially on customary tenure and the ownership of land in that context. So, but here I am presenting this in my capacity as a fellow of the Netherlands Land Academy, because that is where this research was done. I'm representing a team of about 4 members, 2 from Uganda, 1 from Malawi, and 1 from Mozambique. I will be presenting a study that is titled Evaluating Land Titling as a Means to Strengthen Tenure Security in the Context of Land Under Customary Tenure. So briefly, those are the team members. I think I won't go through that because the chair has already taken us through that. The study was done in Uganda, in Malawi, and in Mozambique. So quickly, the background to this study is that secure land rights are considered a key determinant of economic development. And it is always argued that, African indigenous land tenure systems should be transformed or should be registered in order to cause development. That means that they cannot allow development in the state that they are in right now. So, and that development is experienced through poverty eradication, sustainable housing, agricultural productivity, because the notion is that then you're very secure once your land is registered, then you feel safe, and then you're able to develop your land in whatever forms you want to. So a number of countries, just like the 3 that we sampled in the study, Uganda and Mozambique, have taken steps to pilot some of the approaches that have come on board to try and formalize customary land. And these come under the title of fit-for-purpose approaches to land administration. So they have the concept of systematic titling, and also leveraging various advancements in technology. For example, the use of open source software, storage of information in the cloud, crowdsourcing, among other technology advancements. The tools have, however, focused on immediate problems. I could also term this as perceived tenure security, and overlooking the sustainability, the long-term impacts of registration, but also how registration fits into the statutory frameworks of land governance. So that is sort of the problem that we examined to see how it is manifesting across the different, the 3 countries, and what has been done in light of that. So the objectives of the study were to assess the situation of customary land registration in the 3 countries, also in relation to large-scale land-based investments, to document the successes and the challenges of these initiatives, and also draw lessons to inform future land titling initiatives in Africa. The methodology adopted, we first of all had literature review, and then we did sampling for field work. Primary data collection was done through interviews, through community dialogues, after which the data was analyzed and then the results presented in a report. So first findings, I think briefly, after doing the literature review, we really looked at also pre-colonial eras. What was it like prior to colonialism? So from Malawi, we saw that land was held communally by the various tribes. And indeed, like it has been reiterated from the previous sessions, it is the local and traditional leaders that were in charge of this land. It was categorized under Crown land and private, under a certificate of claim, and also the native trust land. And this is also very clear in Uganda, where I come from, where we have a particular certificate that is given for purposes of customary land that is different from what document is given when it comes to statutory tenure systems. By those I mean freehold, for the case of Uganda, leasehold, and then Milo. Then they had the Land Act that came into force to try and recognize public, private, and customary land, and later on the National Land Policy. For the case of Uganda, it's also almost similar. It was customarily held prior. Then for us, the 1995 Constitution is the one that now categorized into 4 tenure systems, recognizing customary tenure as a standalone tenure system alongside the 3. So that gave it power to exist as a standalone tenure system. But of course, when it came to the actualization of this, how land is held customarily, what customs and norms govern this tenure system, it sort of became a problem in actualizing that. So it also saw subsequent legislation, which is the Land Act, the National Land Policy, that really makes also progressive proposals when it comes to administration of customary land. It proposes for establishment of a customary land registry like it is for the rest of the tenure system. So that's the case for Uganda. And for Mozambique, which is also quite similar, it was governed across the country by traditional leaders and colonialists in complex relationships. So this also indicates the complexities when it comes to, power, to the control. You say traditional leaders have, the power to control, but when it comes to maybe land investments, nearing of the mines that are coming into communities in South Africa. So who then has the power? Is it the government? Is it at that time in Mozambique? It was between the colonialists and the traditional leaders. The current tenure system in Mozambique, governed by a range of legal frameworks like it is in the rest of the two countries, and then also the establishment upon independence of a dual system that is very clear across Africa and very clear across the three countries, is that you have the statutory systems of tenure existing alongside what in most cases is called informal or customary tenure. So from what we find out in the study, it is clear that the legal framework in these countries provides for documentation under customary arrangements that confer the user rights of the occupants, and indeed provides for documentation of that. So in Mozambique, for example, we have what we call the duat that is given, and then the certificate of customary ownership that is given in Uganda to recognize someone's rights under customary tenure. The documents and information ascertained can later be used to process through in Uganda, there is a provision that one can convert their customary rights into freehold rights, and so are able to acquire a certificate of title under the freehold tenure system. And this is also clear cut across the three countries. Several land documentation initiatives are in place, but they are being led by either the private or the public sector. So the fact that the approach, the fit for purpose approach, is also something that is, being brought into African countries and being, directed to be used there with all its advantages and probably disadvantages. You find of this project. So there is a connection between what the public is doing slightly, but also mostly driven by the objectives of the private sector or whoever organization is implementing a particular project. Countries are also making strides when it comes to building their land information systems, and these are also technological advancements that are trying to move away from the non-digital ways of managing and producing land information to more digitalized ways and more, technical ways of handling that. So, and that also is what, informs the relevance of fit-for-purpose approaches, because they are more for digitizing, more of collecting data in digital forms, so that then it is fed into that into the system. That comes with its own problems, but I won't go into so much detail, maybe later during the discussion. So some of the words I quote directly from the interviews that we did is that for the information to fit within the land information system, certain technical requirements must be adhered to. Now remember, you're superimposing or you're doing work under the customary tenure system that probably requires you to have a general boundaries approach. In most cases, communities know where their land, boundaries are, not maybe very precisely, but when you impose a system on that, it requires that you have this precise, definition of boundaries. So how do we navigate that? Secondly, it is crucial for the Uganda's legal framework, especially the Survey Act and Registration of Titles Act, to be amended to allow the current initiatives. So these, in most cases, are operating outside of the confinements of the law. because you find that the law provides for simple measurement, simple administration of customary land. But then when you want to elevate it to what is statutory, then where do you leave the customs? How do you incorporate that in that? So that was lacking across the three countries. Then the development of workflows on, okay, after you have done the past registration, what happens after that if you have not put into systems? And that also includes when it comes to large-scale land-based investments, acquisition of this land by probably foreigners that do not belong to particular communities. What systems, what processes, what procedures are they supposed to go through if they have not been clearly defined when it comes to the administration of customary land? Some of the successes and challenges, successes from the community.
Judith, you have 2 minutes left.
Yes, thank you very much, moderator. So reduction in the cost of land registration, because you're doing it systematically, that means that some costs are reduced. Increased passive security of tenure. This perceived is when someone feels secure, but the actual one, whether the state protects, whether the systems in place protect their tenure security is another question. Reduction in land conflict, because definitely adjudication is done. Increased economic returns and reduction in land registration. Challenges that came up were ineffectiveness in combating prevailing cultural norms that discriminate against women. Those were very, very clear. And beneficiaries note that even when these registrations have been done, whatever documentation or the output of these initiatives is not fulfilling. Some don't even receive their documents at the end. The insufficient resources for purposes of sustainability and also inadequate awareness when these projects are commencing. In conclusion, land registration and titling is not an end in itself, but a means to one end. So it is evident that for a project to be successful, all parties have to be involved, and also women land rights need to be at the center, because they are the most users of land, especially when it comes to customary tenure. Some of the recommendations that were made is that titling systems have to be well grounded in the legal and policy frameworks that govern both statutory and customary systems, and then also they should be tailored to allow quickening the processes, but also operating to ensure that deliverables are given to the citizens or to whatever community is in question. And then attention needs to be paid to rights of women, children, and the vulnerable audiences. For moving forward, we have put together a documentary that we'll be happy to share with the organizing committee of the conference to try and elaborate, but also bring firsthand, community voices when it comes to this issue. Thank you very much for listening. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Judith, for that very interesting presentation with lots of lessons for South Africa. We will now give about 5 minutes to allow your presentation to be translated in the various languages. And so don't be too alarmed if there's this silence for the next 5 minutes, because we want to allow the translation process. And then as soon as that's complete, we will then resume.
Sorry, Judith, can you kindly stop sharing your screen, please?
Judith a share research ya gage ya a dirileng ko di country tse tharo e beng Uganda, Malawi le Mozambique. A bua ka customary tenure certificates le gore batho ba tshwara yang lefatshe before colonialization le after colonialization a bua ka gore lefatshe ne le tshwerwe yang ne. So subject ya gage ke evaluating land title as a means to strengthen customary tenure gore title deed e re buang ka yone a etla thusa go natlafatsa ditshwanelo tsa rona tsa setso le tsa botho mo lefatsheng tsa lefatshe ne. A re mogatlo wa gage o dira ka advocacy ke yone ya go mobilize le batho le go sebela di-politicians tsa rona tse dirang molao gore dire molao o re o ratang le research ke dipatlisiso ka ba bua ka ditshwanelo tsa lefatshe tsa setso customary le ntse re bua ka yone ntweng. So a bua ka ba ne ba investigate gore ba ne ba investigate gore a long term registration ke yone o ba lebella gore a e thusitse batho go fitlhella ditshwanelo tseo tsa bone tsa lefatshe le gore e farologana yang ene e diragala yang ko mafatsheng a mararo ao e leng Uganda, Malawi le Zimbabwe. So ba lebella gore tse dintle tsa teng ke tse di feng, which is successes, tse di maswe tse di teng, which is challenges, or challenges ke matsapa not necessarily tse di maswe. A re method o ba o dirisitseng go dirisa research eo ke literature review ke go batla mo inthaneteng le ko di archiveseng go e bala le go sampola le gore ba tsaya a ke re ga re di example tsa practice ya tenure dia ke tse 100 o tse lekgolo mara re tla tsa fela tse 10 re tsa di sampling a ke re wa itse re tsaya bikinyana ya mobu fela go tlo sheba gore the whole grant in ntse yang, and then ba interviewa le batho ba sing everybody ko Uganda ba sampola, and then ba lebella gape history ya before colonial a fitla le after gore go diragetseng. So are before colonial a fete batho na ba tshwere lefatshe go ya ka setso ne ba le tshwere ba tlhakanetse ne go sena gore go na le trata ya mamang place fela fokae or whatever le go sena so se bitswang place ne go sena di boundary batho ne ba tsamaya fela ba lebella mafulo a kwa leng teng gore ko ba batlang go phela ko teng. So a re ko Uganda kwa ena tlhagang teng lefatshe le ne le tshwere yalo go ya ka di customs tsa bone, and then but because of the custom ha di tshwane o kre gore Basotho re dira yana, Batswana re dira yana, baso ha teng batho ba le ba ko Mozambique ba dira yana, go nna thata gore o ka kwala molao wa setso ene o ka wa re o ke one molao wa go governor go ya ka setso go nna thata ka baka la gore ga re dirise setso se sa rona ka go tshwana ra farologana. A re process ya go recognize a customary tenure ya be nna bokete ka lebaka leo la gore customary lo ga e tshwane e ya ka gore batho ba ba bone ba dumelana ka go dira so ya nna gore le gona nonyana le ga ba na le customary tenure ha e recognize because ga se mokwalo o kwetsweng fo fatshe ya ka ga le molao wa sekgowa o ntse. So a re go Mozambique le go fitla ka jeko lefatshe le ka boniwa ke dikgosi, and then power
Thank you for
control.
those that have done the translation. And welcome back. We move on now to our second presentation.
Which will be translation
at the gender impact formalization
Thanks.
Of land tenure. And to do that, we've got Pilan, I can see you're there, and Chilombo. Please kick off the presentation, and do remember that it's 15 minutes, and after that we will also break for the translations. Can I ask those that are joining us online, because we are running behind time and will not have time to take questions from those online, if you've got questions or comments, please put them in the chat function, and those can then be picked up when the presenters respond. So we will only go to the venues for the questions and comments, but we will not directly relate to those that are online unless you put something in the chat. Thank you. So over to you, Pilan.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for joining this session. Thank you very much, our esteemed chairperson. Today we are going to talk about the impact of formalization on women's land rights in Southern Africa, together with my colleague, Chilombo Musa. So I will briefly talk about the context, then the logic of formalization, introduce our case studies more broadly before Chilombo dives deeper into the empirical findings. I would appreciate, Chair, if you can remind us of time because we had planned for 20 minutes. So as my colleague there, Judith, has been trying to emphasize, there has been this dramatic development in Africa about the need for formalization of property rights in land. And our chairperson has written authoritatively on it. And this has been through, surveying of boundaries, registration, and documentation of customary land rights as a way to improve tenure security. But in other cases, it also actually involves this conversion of customary land rights to state tenure, as in Zambia, or radical changes in the land uses, therefore transforming the landscape and land administration. I think that theoretically, this proposition is more embedded in the evolutionary models of land tenure rights. This kind of central logic is that landholding is actually evolving into individualized systems in ways that reflect the Western forms of private property to the benefit of many. And this is what Yingstrom has conceptualized as evolutionary development. And to signify this trend on the African continent, you'll see that between 1990 and 2017, there were 32 new land laws. If we add Malawi 2018, that makes it 33, which were enacted across sub-Saharan Africa. And much of them actually focus on this need to formalize rights on customary lands. And the African Union has also actually declared a goal of 30% of all registered land to be in a woman's name by 2025, which they are not going to However, it still remains. How is this formalization working for women who are still living in rural areas? And the envisaged benefits that we hear are that this kind of formalization will enable women, rural women, to own property in their own names, co-own family and common property resources, bequeath land as inheritance, borrow money from banks and invest, and that it will also lead to the transfer of land to efficient farm users, replacement of patriarchal customary land governance systems, and the reduction of land conflicts and violence against women. Some even argue that it's going to lead to the deepening of democracy on the African continent. So we have a situation where these land titles are also being equated to women's land tenure security. But these benefits are now being forcibly supported by empirical data and not just theoretical propositions. And Rwanda is often the case that is referred to because they've managed to register over 11 million parcels and they've issued 7 million certificates of title. They now have the Land Administration Information System. And this Rwanda program is said to have improved land access for women significantly and also prompted better recording of inheritance rights without gender bias, and to have had a massive impact on investments. And if you look at the World Bank 2020, Rwanda is actually ranked first in registering property in Africa and third worldwide after Qatar and New Zealand. And proponents of this formalization also tend to glorify the land registration in Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Uganda. But our departure point is that this formalization approach largely narrows down to a depoliticized statistical approach. That is how many certificates have been issued as a measure of progress and development. And in so doing, it ignores the broader context of power and property relations, which are not gender neutral, the territorial interests of the state, which can be quite authoritarian if you look at Rwanda and even Ethiopia, and other stakeholders, local and foreigners' interests, to reconfigure and claim authority over land, and in particular, the consequences for the socially excluded groups in their differentiated way, especially women, the focus of this presentation. But given this kind of debates, I think we can no longer enrich the horizons of knowledge through ideological persuasions, but solid field-based case studies. Therefore, we carried our study in Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa. And across those 4 countries, we administered 443 questionnaires. In addition, we had qualitative interviews. We also worked with the Zambia Land Alliance, Livaningo, a platform for youth and community development, and Guzi Development Association in Limpopo. And what we found out is that formalization is actually taking different forms in different countries. If you look at Mozambique, the 1997 law, as Judith said, actually provides for the registration of land use rights, which is known as the DUAT. And this covers individuals, both men and women, communities and investors. But huge interest from Western donors and the World Bank Group in particular, which has put in $100 million in 2018, trying to regularize 2 million DUATs. And this program actually targets 40% of beneficiaries to be women. But if you go across to Zambia, there's this unlegislated customary landholding certificate, which is being driven from below by civil society with donor support. So whether legislated or not, registration is becoming more and more important on the African continent. And here, these are some of the women in Mozambique who are holding the DUAT. But for the sake of time, let me move on. And here in Zambia, this is an example of the traditional land holding certificate under Chief Ndake's kingdom. So if we then look at South Africa, quite different dimensions, you're gonna see the movement of urban elites onto customary land who are trying to avoid paying rates and to seek cheaper retirement homes. And in Zimbabwe, there's this phenomenon of the local state appropriating customary land for urban development. There's a lot of dusting of colonial master plan maps of the 1950s that are being done by this post-colonial state. And as some of you might know, these are dominated by kind of high modernist ideologies that hardly capture women's lived realities. But either way, the consequences remain dire for most women, the socially marginalized and poor. So if you look at South Africa here, you can actually see those mansions are actually on customary land. You see the fences, but alongside you have got livestock. And for the sake of time, let me now leave my colleague Chilombo to get into the flesh of some of the empirical findings with the little time that she has. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Philani. So I'll quickly talk about the results. I will share my screen. Just a second.
Chilombo, just say you've got 5 minutes left.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot. Okay. Just carrying on from what Philani has presented, I'll just quickly give the results. We compared 2 countries, Mozambique and Zambia, and also grouped South Africa and Zimbabwe together because of the similarities between those different countries. And so what we see in Mozambique and Zambia is that they have flanking mechanisms going on. So as Philani has already mentioned. And so when we look at the narratives, the development narratives for the formalization of customary land, the first argument is that women will be allowed to own property in their own names as a result of formalization. But what we do find in Mozambique is that there's a differentiation of who or which women have access or benefit from duats. So unmarried women who are living together with their partners, and widowed women as well, tend to benefit more compared to single women or monogamously married women. And we find that divorced women in particular tend to be excluded significantly from registration of their land or ownership of duats. And in Zambia, we do see that it is those women who have access to information, who are more knowledgeable and connected to the local elites, such as chiefs and other traditional leaders, that tend to benefit from the registration of customary landholding certificates. So we see that differentiation that is happening and also leading to exclusion of certain segments of women in our case study. Another argument is that women will be able to own common property resources or have access to that. But what we do find in Mozambique and Zambia is that common property resources are not being registered, whether under duas or under customary landholding certificates, and women are being excluded. And what happens is that women or large-scale land-based investments then tend to take place on the common property resources, and so women are excluded from accessing that land as well. Another argument is that formalization reduces land conflict, and we do see some evidence of this, and this is based on the boundaries that can be determined through formalization processes. So we see in Zambia, for example, that 85% of our respondents said that land conflicts are reducing. However, when it comes to certificate holders or duat holders being able to access credit, we see that that has no significant impact. I'll quickly go on to South Africa and Zimbabwe, where we also compare their experiences based on the dominant narratives. So the commodification of customary land is quite prevalent in both countries. And as Philani mentioned earlier, we see that in South Africa, traditional leaders are selling off customary land. And there is a lot of violence that is being enacted on women. So women are being excluded using violent means. And those who stand up to assert their rights over land are being exposed to violence and sextortion. And in Zimbabwe, it is the local authority. And from our survey, we find that 67% of our respondents have had to pay exorbitant fees in order to access customary land, and most women are excluded because of how high those fees are. And finally, I will end with what the women themselves want. So we asked them, would they prefer to for customary land to be converted, to be formalized? And from our experience, women prefer to live on customary land. However, patriarchal norms still tend to exclude women from the ownership, access and use, control and transfer of customary land. So there are certain modifications that will need to be introduced in policy, in legislation as well, to ensure that women do have better access to land and their tenure security is ensured through the formalization processes, and also to ensure that women are not further disadvantaged through the processes that have already started taking place. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chilombo and Philan, for the very interesting presentation, which in essence is telling us that formalization has got a gender dimension, which is often overlooked and needs to be given due attention in such interventions. We're going to pause for a moment to allow the translation of your presentation to be made, and we will resume again in another 5 minutes with the presentation by Augustine. on the Ghana experience.
Ya mo tabeng ya gore naga e batho ga ile kgale ba dula go yona, so taba ya gore e tshwanetse gore e ngwadisiwe semmušo. Ke taba e direga go dinageng tse di bitsang gore ke tša SADC, Mozambique, South Africa, Zimbabwe and Zambia. Ba bontšhitše gore ge ka nnete naga e ka thoma go dirwa ba ya ngwadišiwa semmušo e la magaeng, se se tlo go thuša ka yona ke goreng basadi le bona ba tlo kgona go ba leng go ba le naga e leng gore e ngwadišitše kang ka maina a bona kere. And then se seng gape ke gore se se tlo go thuša e tlo ba goreng batho ba bomme ba ka kgona goreng e le malapa ba kgona go ba leng, ba kgona go ba le kore ya ba ba jale fa mo nageng e leng goreng e be le yang ya le ya family a kere mo la peleng ka taba ela gore ntshongwe le mo e ngwadišwa ke ka banna, so molao no moso go se o fitlhile o ra gore le ge ntate a sepetše mme o tlo kgona go dirang go tšwetša pele taba ela ya family. And se seng gape se ba se bontšhitšeng ke gore ge ntho e šetše e ngwadišitše batho ba bomme ba ka kgona le gore ba ye go dipanka ba kgone go adimang tšhelete ya kere ya go kgona go tlo hlabollang naga yeo ba dutšeng go yona. And then ge ya pele ba thoma gore na ge yona taba ya formalisation e se diregile go diregang, so ke tlo bolela ka mo South Africa. Ka mo South Africa ntho e thomileng go bonala ba reng bahumi ba ba dula go metsesetoropong ba tšhabela ko magaeng ba thoma go rekang dinaga tše dikgolokgolo mo ba diragong ba go meago gore ge ba tsofala ba tle ba kgone go dula gona lebaka e le goreng ba tšhabelang dipatala tša maemo a godimo kae mo metsesetoropong. So ka mantšu a mangwe ra goreng ba dirang jalo ba thopa naga e leng kabe batho ba dula nageng tša segae e le ya bona. Ene lebaka eno ba lela gone goreng a kere magoši a rekiša, ene ke nngwe e ba boletseng ka yona gore ka mo South Africa naga e tšewa jalo kang ka sedirišwa se o ka se rekišago, gore se re boleleng ka sona gore no naga ke e na le moya ka baka la re tswa go yona re tlo boela go yona. So ge šala e ba commodity ntho ka no go rekiša go swana le page le ora gore e latlhegetše keng bohlokwa jwa yona. And then mohlalo mongwe ba o fileng ka naga ela ya tšela tša ka kwa ntle ba bontšhitše gore o ya bo Mozambique basadi ba kgona le gore le bona naga e be ka maina a bona, mara bao e leng gore ba hladilwe go bang go ba boima. So ka mantšu a mangwe ra gore maemo a mosadi a bolela ge a na le monna o na le maatla, ge monna wa motlogetše maatla a dirang a fokotšega, so e salaetša gore go na le kgatelelo e ntši. And then se sengwe se ba bontšhitše gore taba ya go formalise ke gore ba bantši ba ile re tlo e kgona go fokotšang dikgohlano ka baka la re kgona go tseba gore naga ya mang e go makae ya mang e go makae, so ga e sa le taba ela go kgona go tlo fetša re loele. And then se seng gape ka mo South Africa ke gore batho ba bomme ge ba ema ka maoto magoši a thoma go ba dirang go ba hloya ba bangwe ba okanesa batho gore ba direng ba ba bolae. So ke nngwe e leng gore ke challenge e kgolokgolo. And then se seng gape ko Zimbabwe ya mafelelo ke gore ba re ko Zimbabwe batho ba bomme ba palela ke gore ka naga ka baka la gore tšhelete e godimo.
We changed things a little bit, partly because our colleagues in East London have to go for lunch. There are some logistical challenges. But at the same time, we really want to hear the voices of our colleagues attending the same conference from East London who may wish to comment or ask questions. But on this occasion, it will be based on the two presentations given so far. So I'm going to try and check in with our colleagues in East London. Are there any questions or comments you want to make based on the two presentations so far? Unfortunately, you're going to miss the last one, but I understand you need to go for lunch, and there are some logistical challenges if you don't go now. So just giving you an opportunity there. And to all colleagues, I do apologize for changing the schedule a bit, but I just felt that it might be a fair thing to allow our colleagues to talk to us as well. East London, can you hear me, and can you confirm that there are questions or comments?
Yes, we can hear you, and yes, we have people with questions and comments, so I'm giving them that opportunity now.
Good afternoon, comrades. Kwakhona igama lam ndinomonde Phindani. I think I just want to comment on the very last presentation by Philani and Chilombo. Yeah, just two things that are frustrating me. Maybe just to refer to us as women. I think sometimes we get so excited. You know, we get so excited with little things that we think are achievements, specifically here in our country. If we have 50% of women representation in parliament, you say, hey. I mean, that excites us, and we don't know what that means. We have got like more than 50% of women that are representing us in parliament today. But is that, I mean, helping us as women, like poor women, poor disadvantaged women? I mean, I'm just like listening to this presentation about how women, you know, are being considered in terms of formalization of ownership and property ownership. One, for me, it does not matter how much land do we have access to, because at the same time, we can be given land, but at the same time being disadvantaged. Because one, if you look at the history of the oppression of women in this country, there's a lot that needs to be done. Given land, you can give me 50 hectares of land. That on its own, it doesn't assist me. Because one, you give me land, you don't give me any support on top of that. We know that we have been excluded economically as women. If you give me a farm, financially, I don't have skills, you know. Secondly, I can plant thousands and thousands and have tons and tons of produce, but there's no market. Where do I sell those? I've not been equipped properly. So land, whether it's in my name or it's not in my name, for me, doesn't make any difference. Because when you look at empowering women, you need to empower women, you know, holistically. I don't know how to put this, but land on its own, whether it is in your name, for me, that does not excite me. You give me land, I have produce, I don't know where to sell my produce. I have produce, I don't have financial management skills. I have land, I don't have tools, I mean, like we see what is happening here in South Africa. The government will go and give women, reverse impini, there's tall as 1,000, who value is called, minister, minister, because this way reverse 10, there's tall as 1,000. Should that excite us? Are we supposed to be excited with that? There's no water, there's no roads, there's lack of access to markets. For me, that is not women empowerment. We are still excluded economically. Thank you.
Molweni othethayo ngumama ubusisiwe Chalana umajali isibongo usuka kwaBhaca eManfreya kwilale phansi kwentaba saseMatatiyeli naseManfletha. Njengoba sendivile ke kuthethwa ngomhlaba, kuthethwa ngomama, bendike ndafuna ukuthi isoil, ndaphinde ndathi hey ngathi eligama elithi soil inoba lincinci kuno land okanye uland mncinci kuno soil. Ndaqoma ndibubhideka xa ndizawuthi soil ndizawuthetha uba ndithetha ngomhlaba lona uba ndingase ndihambe ndiyokha umhlaba ndihambe ndiyowuthesta uba ulungele ntoni. Xa ndizawuthe ngoku ndithetha ngoland Ndizawuthetha ke ngondide ndiyothi ngqu ngezimbiwa. Ndava ke ngokuthethwa ngomama, ngokucinezeleka komama. Nje xa ndiyicinga le nto ndazibuza uba kanene bangaphi oomama apha ke kweli cala lethu. Uba ndiyeva kwezinye indawo ingathi kubhetele kwamanye amazwe, kodwa lapha eSouth Africa ingathi kubhetele noba kushena kwendawo. Ndazibuza uba inoba bangaphi kanene oomama aba-owna ii-mines, bengaphi oomama aba-owna ezolimo. Sike sithi nje nanku umama unala fama, nalwa unala fama, unala fama. Ndanexhala ndava le mithetho kumane kuthiwa khona imithetho yahlulahlula imithetho. Ndaba kwabheka ndabheka ezilalini, ndaba kwathi umama kudala ecinezelekile. Njengoba sijonga ukutshatwa ngotata, uqala utata athi xa ndithatha athi ndiyakuthanda. Emveni koko angezi nomtshato wathi urhulumente hayi funeka nihambe nibe niyotshata. Ngapha kuthiwe hayi uba utshate ngokwesintu uhamba wawenzelwa utsiki utshatile. Ithi yakufa le ndoda indishiye kube sekusithiwa hayi wena awukho semthethweni ngoba kukhona lona yena unantoni unephepha. Mna nditshate ngokwesintu kuthiwa yi-customary marriage. Ndiyayithanda into ke ngokwendike ndathi ukuyithi rhitha apha ezindlebeni zam uba ingathi kwayona leyo umtshato wesintu ingathi uyarecognizwa urhulumente. Ndiyayibulela loo nto kurhulumente ngoba loo nto ijonga abafazi, ngoba thina sicinezeleke kangangoba singabafazi. Awukwazi ukuyirhuqa indoda uthi masihambe siyosayina ulinde kuye, ngoba xa usithi tata masiyosayina ubuza uba sowufuna undibulala. Ngofuna kulinde kuye ke ngokuba athi nkosikazi masihambe siyosayina ngoba ulinde uba kungathiwa ngumbulali. Thina abantu bangomama ukuba ngaba kwenzekile kwafa utata kunalaa nto yoba kuthiwe hayi ngumama lombuleleyo. Ndinexhala izinto esizenziwayo singomama azikho semgangathweni. Kube kusithiwa sikhululekile. Ngubani loye wakhululeka? Ithetha uba kukhululeke utata phezu kwamama. Kunzima xa siyithetha indaba yokhululeka thina apha eSouth Africa. Sikhululekile kodwa inkululeko singomama asikakayazi. Siyarhalela uba urhulumente akabheke banzi, abheke banzi oomama uba bakhululeke entloboni. Ngela xesha kwakusithiwa umama makangathi ebeleke umntwana abe ethwele inyanda abe ephethe ibhegi, kwakuthetha into efana nalena. Namhlanje sisayenza nangoku utata uphethe igqudu uhambe ecala kwam usithi nanku unkosikazi wam. Siyarhalela ukhululeka kuyo yonke le ngcinezelo. Xa bendisiza apha uthi utata bendigibele emotweni yakhe uthi utata wakwakho ukuvumele uba uhambe uye kule conference. Ithetha uba bekufanele uba kuze utata apha. Kanjani? Kuthi ukuthi thina bomama asinawukwazi sekwenza nto. Uxolo tata, ndinomfanekiso xa ngaba emotweni siqhuba sihamba sibabini, nihamba ngasemva kwam, ndihamba ngale ndlela ekufanele uba ndihambe ngayo kule ndlela. Nithi apha semva kuyabonakala uba ngumfazi lokuqhuba le moto ngendlela ahamba ngayo. Uthi xa usodlula ufumanisa uba ibingengomfazi ngutata. Awuphinde ubusatsho uba hayi kuthe kanti ayinguye umfazi, kuthe kanti ngutata. Awubisatsho uyiyeka undibhaxekile ngalaa nto uba umama always ujonge uba uloko ephantsi ukatata, uloko erongo. Siyacela urhulumente makayijonge le nto yomama. Enkosi.
Okay. No, it's two questions. One is the end result of the titling process. Are we promoting private property? And if yes, what about firstly the cost of the titling process? Secondly, what I mean, if we privatize land, and how are we going to ensure that people have access to land, those that are not, I mean, the land that is not being utilized by the owners? because I think that's where the problem is for me. People who have titles tend to keep this land even if they are not utilizing it. When there are people who want land but have no access to it.
All right. Just a small translation, so to speak, to give a gist of issues that were raised, which are very important. The first issue which has come from Umama is the whole range of ownership in terms of importance of prime land. How many women in the studies have owned the prime land? I should think people should think that it's a statement, it's a question. How many people are owning the prime land? And the prime land in South Africa will include coastal, will include some kind of waterfalls and other things. How many women in these countries are owning the prime land? The second question, which is the last thing, it's not a question, but it's how women in a customary setup are normally being treated. So you make an example. She make an example of a married woman that his husband passed away whilst the ownership is known during the time of the man that was with her as their land. But once that husband passed away, then that lady would be chased out of the house by the family, which is a known story in South Africa. Was there any findings around that, where women will say, we have land, I'm married to so-and-so, but now so-and-so is dead? And the last issue, the whole stigma. Whatever in society which is bad, he's making an example of a woman driving a perceived car that the person behind perceived that it is a woman that is driving it. And anything that is wrong with that driving would be said it's a woman. But once you then verify who the driver is a man, you don't even make an apology. The status of women in South Africa in terms of being underlooked in terms of doing things. Those are key issues, I think, for the speakers to respond to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, East London, for those fascinating questions and the comments that you've given as well. I'm going to give our panelists an opportunity to try and respond to those three questions. And Augustine, I know you haven't presented yet, but I do know that you've done some work in this area, so you'll be included as well. Shall I start with Judith? Do you want to respond to those the questions and comments? Judith, can you hear me? If Judith is not yet ready, shall I go to Pilan? Can you do that?
Yes, please, Chair. Thank you, Chairperson. I think important questions and also important comments and inputs, which also reflect the diverse nature of participants, just like some of our respondents. I think the first thing I want to respond to is on whether land on its own is enough, if I got that correctly. Definitely it isn't. From our empirical findings, it was very clear to us that we didn't actually find direct effects of these rural land registration programs on agricultural productivity and investment. And to many women, what mattered most to productivity and investment was linking tenure to large-scale state-supported programs that kind of support productivity and even linked to local models of industrialization that work for the people. So, yeah, that's response number one. And this idea that women will be getting capital from the private actors simply because they now have a certificate is quite problematic. It's problematic even at a policy level. If you look at Mozambique, it doesn't allow the customary land to be used as collateral. In Zambia, where it's silent, only 1.7% of respondents had actually managed to get some form of loan from microfinances. Be that as it may, you cannot expect the private players to be at the center of engineering rural development you still need a capable, a democratic and efficient state to drive that. Then the question on whether this is a privatization model, definitely. Formalization, we see it as a privatization model, but it's a privatization model that is being implemented gradually and less costly. The players at the center of this, I was talking about Mozambique, the World Bank Group put $100 million US. If I make reference to the amount of money being put in these programs, you would also see where it's coming from and the logic behind. And probably, eventually, the idea also, as Chilombo was saying, is also to create some kind of land bank for the investors to make the land legible so that they can acquire what they consider maybe to be vacant, underutilized land, which, however, is used for common property resources. And then maybe lastly, somebody was saying, what is the future of this? The sustainability is also questionable. In our study area in Zambia, you could begin to see that there were some difficulties, even in terms of managing the local, the local register. The people who were working on it, paralegals, people who were tech savvy, the para-savers, they were actually leaving, and that register is not even up to date in the absence of outside finances. And the certificate is not the solution at all, because we also realized the increased rates of homelessness and landlessness. We could have shown you to the pictures. These are actually connected to people defaulting, whereby the state is turning customary land into state tenure. A lot of poor people are failing to pay, and they are having their land acquired by the state. So to us, it's not a model. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pilan. And I realize we're running out of time, and our colleagues in East London need to go now. So I won't ask the other two presenters to come in now, but I would ask our colleagues in East London if you could do a translation of the response that Pilani has given to our friends there. Meanwhile, I think we should get on with the program here, and I'm going to invite Augustine, who will come and talk to us about land titling experiences in Ghana. Over to you, Augustine.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Let me share my screen. Okay. Right. Good afternoon, colleagues, and I'm highly honored to be part of this conference, and also to present to you land law reform, land title registration, and tenure security in Ghana. And I come from PLAS, University of the Western Cape. Many has been said in relation to formalization and how it has shaped the tenure security and title registration in Ghana or even in Africa. And I see from my observation in relation to what transpired yesterday and also this morning, I see one continent with a common virus of dispossession, which is perpetrated by the state, local elite and foreigners, and which has led to precarious livelihood for rural and peri-urban dwellers. So I'm going to give you a presentation on how this has happened in Ghana, and I'll give you introduction, this is my presentation outline. And the key argument that I'm making from this paper that I'm presenting to you is that the conception of that land law reform will provide a strong legal framework for land title registration, and the formalization of customary land rights will support the tenure security of poor households and women in particular are a misnomer in Ghana. Rather, historically, land law reforms are implemented to shield capitalist accumulators to perpetuate their exploitation of poor households through land title registration, and the reforms fortify the position of traditional authorities in land administration to expropriate their subjects during land communitization without the state's interference. So I try to look at this using secondary data and then also my master's research that I did it in Abraso and Kromasi in Pereban, Ghana. So looking at the context, I know my two colleagues have given us a full background about what is happening in terms of formalization and trying to look at this one in a historical context. In colonial period, Africa, there were a lot of land reforms that were done. And these land reforms, the colonial land reforms, distorted the African customary tenure systems. Unused lands were claimed as state lands, as Oke Ogendo and other scholars have written. And the theories that were underpinning these land law reforms in colonial period and also post-colonial periods, I know Pilan has spoken a lot about that. And the key purpose of this land reform, especially the contemporary land reform, which is being underpinned by a model of evolutionary theory of land rights, the purpose is to give robust legal backing for land title registration, improve tenure security, and alleviate poverty and promote economic growth. And looking at this in the context of Ghana, Ghana has implemented land law reform since colonial period. And researchers have documented that land title registration is slow in Ghana contemporary, and most of the customary lands are not registered. Also, there are tenure insecurities, especially in Pereban communities, which are experiencing commoditization as a result of the expansion of the urban communities towards these communities. And as a result of that, there are a lot of evictions leading to contestations, breakdown of social cohesion, and then also poor livelihoods among indigenous people. And if you look at land law reforms, scholars have documented that land law reforms are a political process. And as a result of that, it brings about changes in land tenure system, land administration, and social relations. But most of the land law reforms that are being conducted, especially in Ghana, they do not involve the people. So I try to look at this one in a historical context, whereby I assess the land law reforms, how the purpose of implementing these reforms have shaped land title registration and tenure security, and the factors that have determined the impact of the land law reform on land title registration and tenure security in Ghana. And the findings that I got, in colonial period, the colonial masters used initially treaties to enter into local arenas. So these were reforms that they started, where they set up their own tribunals, and they used people who were educated to now interpret the customs. And this time, at this period, treaties were signed between communities. So common ones are the Tripartite Treaty of 1831 in Ghana, the one of 1844, the Treaty of Formalisation. And all these treaties were used by the colonial masters to enter into local land matters, which at that time, there was no total control of Ghana by the colonial master. And the second phase of colonialism is where they use ordinances and constitutions to now control land matters. There were a lot of bills that were passed. And these ordinances gave traditional authorities more power, which did not exist in the customary land administration. And as a result of that, the traditional councils were rejected, and people did not have power over the lands. They were considered as usufructs, which did not even also exist. And they started now interpreting the land rights according to the European land tenure system. And how did this affect land title registration? They introduced deed registration, and the deed registration, it happened that only the local elites and the foreigners were able to purchase customary land rights, lands, and then register them with the state. And then also tenure security was also very poor because there were a lot of dispossessions in mining communities and also in areas where there were agricultural economic booms. And as a result of that, because of the political alliance between the state and then the traditional leaders through the indirect rule system, the state did not interfere in matters relating to land. So in the factors that determine the impact of colonial land reforms on land title registration and tenure security in the historical context, One was that awareness of the existence of the land laws was one issue, which most people were not aware of those land laws because they were not involved in the land law reform process. And then also there were no education. There was no education on these land laws. Only the local elites and the foreigners were able to use the laws for their benefit. Also, statutory recognition of the customary land administration and the political alliance also gave the chiefs the power. So as a result of that, they were able to expropriate the people, and they invoked the state power to now back whatever they were doing. The same thing happened in post-colonial period when I conducted this research. There are a lot of land reforms that have been conducted, and most of these reforms are backed or supported by donors. And as a result of that, it has strengthened the position of the chiefs in contemporary Ghana. And chiefs now invoke the power of the state to expropriate their people. So in terms of land title registration, land law reforms have not done anything to improve upon it because there is too slow. Land title registration is very slow, and then also only few people are able to register their land. Tenure security is also very poor, especially in areas around the urban center, that is the peri-urban areas. And the factors that have determined the impact of land law reform on contemporary Ghana in terms of land title registration in post-colonial Ghana.
You've got 3 minutes.
One is existence
3 minutes,
of
Augustine.
2 minutes.
3 minutes. 3.
All right, thank you. One is existence of de facto land title registration. There's an argument out there that when people are highly educated, they will be able to register their land. But from my research, I realized that people who are highly educated, if there is a de facto land title registration, they do not participate in the formal land title registration. So in Ghana, because of the existence of this de facto land title registration, where traditional authorities give allocation note and site plan to landowners, especially for residential purposes, people do not participate in the formal land title registration. Another thing is that most people are not aware of the land laws. They are not part of the land law reform process. And there's also poor education on land laws. And land title registration procedure is also cumbersome and also complex. People also don't see the relevance of lease. And the planning of the community is also a problem. So one respondent from the physical planning department said that people don't know anything about the lease. And the reason is that using a lease as a collateral, which is propagated by Hernando de Soto, that people will use title certificate. People don't see the need of using the lease as a collateral for a loan from a bank. And even because of the clauses, people are even scared to do a lease. Another thing that I also realized was that land title registration is also slow is because of the land use type, litigation over land, and threat from traditional authorities can also determine the impact of land law reform. So in terms of tenure security, when there is a change in chieftaincy administration, either by dismissal or death, people tenure is also affected because the succeeding chief can ask the landowners to bring their document, and if you don't have a document over your land, you are going to pay for that land that you are owning. And another thing that I also found in this research was that the chiefs are breaking their fiduciary rules, and they do not get any persecution or there is no state interference. And people are crying or they are talking about this issue, which a respondent gave, but because of time I cannot read. So I found that because of the statutory recognition of customary land administration and political alliance between chiefs and politicians, now the chiefs have a lot of power and the politicians are unable to step in. So one respondent mentioned this one in the Ashanti region, where the Ashanti king is, that in Ashanti region, for instance, chiefs is controlling everything. So if you are a head of a department or a district chief executive, you do not have control over these things. They will take you to Mensha, that is Ashanti Palace. As a head of the department, you have nothing to say over there. This is why the laws are not being enforced. And sometimes even the kings do not respect the laws that have been made. The Asante King mentioned this. Not all that is printed in the Act, that is the Land Act 1036, is applicable to his jurisdiction. He put chiefs and fetish chiefs in charge of the lands in his kingdom. The chiefs are not accountable to any youth. So there is now a new form of redefinition of custom. So in conclusion, what I got from this paper is that land law reform has created a new indirect rule system where the state, local elites, and foreigners use the traditional system to dispose households from their ancestral lands during land commoditization. And as a result of that, people are now living in precarious life, and especially women, they have to commute, especially the peri-urban communities, they have to commute from the peri-urban areas to the urban center every day in order to get their sustenance. So I'm recommending that land law reform in Ghana and even elsewhere must involve the whole country and must be incremental instead of it being swift and discontinuous, but normally funded by donors and international institutions. And chiefs should supervise clans to allocate their lands to land purchases. Instead of lands being allocated by chiefs, it should be by the clans or the families. Now, the state should also revise its land laws and provide the legal backing for the de facto land title registration of giving site plan and allocation, because the people themselves, they know how to protect their land, and the research has shown that people know how to protect that, they know their boundaries, and even a research I conducted in my field found that. So that is what I would like to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Augustine. Thank you for your presentation and sharing the experiences of Ghana. I'm gonna pause now to allow translation of your presentation, and then we will resume. And when we resume, as I said, if you are joining us online, we ask that you write your comments in the chat or questions in the chat. We will then go to Johannesburg and Durban for some questions or comments. I do apologize. I realize it's 1 o'clock already, but we're running a little bit late, and we will need to use at least another 10 to 15 minutes to wrap up our session. So I hope you can bear with us on that.
Var magoshi na le matla mantšintši ka kudu, and then nagore ba ba šoro fitla ko kana ba kreile le gore batho naga ba e laola ka segaga bo bona, and then ga ba fihla ba thoma go hlola tše re ka di bitsang gore ke eng ke dikgwerano, di-treaties akere, and then ka gare ga go hlola yona dikgwerano tše ba ba lebeletse gore na kana ke mang a tsebang sekgowa ke mang kgonang go bala, and then ba tšea bona batho ba thoma go ba dirang go ba dira bona ba etapele. And then se se leng sa dira gore batho ba ka bogala re ba kwešiša gore na bona makgowa ba nyaka go direga jwang, ya ba bona batho ba mathomo ba thoma go dira go reka naga ba babile ba dirang ba engwadiša ka maina a bona a kere be ba le kgauswi le bona babuši bao. And then se seng se se bonagetseng ebile gore gona ko kana ka baka la gore mmušo o robala mmagoleng le magoši, ge magoši ba tšeela batho naga mmušo bo sa tsene ka gare ka baka la gore batho ba ba dirang ba bereka mmogo akere. And then se seng gape ko gore magoši a ba ne le maatla go dirang a go no thoma gore no mo re nyako go hodiša batho ka baka la gore mmaene o atla, le ge mmušo o tseba o bo sa ke o dira selo lebaka le legolo e le goreng they are in alliance akere, so ba berekišana mmogo. And then se seng se ba boletseng ka sone ko gore go lebelela mola metse setoropong ke gona mo e leng gore taba ela ya bodulo jo bo sego bja šireletša e be e le godimodimo, lebaka eno ba goreng a kere mo metse setoropong difeme tše dikgolo ke mo di nyakang go aga difeme, ke mo ba nyakang go aga dintlo, so ke gona mo e leng gore batho ba kgona go amogela naga ka bontši e suppose ka mokgwa rena re phelang ka gona a ke rena ka mo South Africa gantši naga e tšeiwa kae ko magaeng ka baka la gore go na le dimaene. And then Se seng se sengwe gona ko kana ba re batho ga ba ne kwešišo yang ya melao ya naga ke ka lebaka le magoši a diragong a ipshinago ka bona ka lebaka la gore melao e gona ka lebaka la gore batho ba sa tsebe gore na ditokelo tša bona ba ka di-claima jwang so magoši a no dira gore ntho ngwe le ngwe ba e dirago e no tšwela pele so se seng gabe re ko kana ge kgoši e ka hlokofala kgoši e mpša ge e tsena e tlo le botšiša gore na pampiri tša mo o dulago di kae ge ka hwetša o se na le tšona gore gore nage ya se ya gago wa e tšea o e fa o mongwe. And then magoši matlabane gona gane se seng ba dirile ko gore ke magoši ke mmuso le di-politicians ba dira ba bereka mmogo ke ka baka le magoši ko kana a tšwelang pele go no ba le maatla a mantšintši and magoši gape ba direng magoši ga a hlompheng melao yeo e leng gona ya go amana le tša mabu so mogala jo o re se se santseng se dirwe ko goreng taba e ya phetolelo ya mabu e santse e direle batho karolo e magoši ba ka e bapalang ke ya goreng ba e be di-supervisors ke ya ba bona ba lebelela go taba go rekiša naga.
And we're going to start with our friends who are in Durban. Over to you, Durban. Any questions or comments?
Good afternoon, everyone. Ngizokusho lokhu ngolimi lwami uze kungene gxile kubantu abalizwayo. Inkinga zethu la eAfrika ziyafana. Uhulumeni noma ama-investors sekucacile ukuthi uma efuna ukudla umhlaba noma exhaphaza abantu abamnyama basebenzisa ubuholi bomdabu. Abaholi bomdabu bayavuma nabo ukuthi bebe lithuluzi lokusetshenziswa ama-investors. Imayini uma efuna ukuhlukumeza abantu abamnyama zisebenzisa futhi wona amakhosi. For instance, eGhana bebe nendlela yabo yokuphila. Uhulumeni noma ama-investors aseyishintsha leyo ndlela abantu bephila ngayo sebefaka imithetho yabo bese bepromota benikeza amandla onke amakhosi ukuthi uma sekukhuluma inkosi sekukhuluma umlomo ongathethi imali. Nakhona ke la eSouth Africa izimo ezinjengalezo noma ikuphi lapho kubona kudliwa khona umhlaba kusuke kunamakhosi ngemuva ecashise ama-investors noma imayini. Usho ukuthi nabaholi bethu bomdabu bayavuma benziwe ihawu longxiwankulu ngoba yonke lento sinjena nje sikwi-system yongxiwankulu iyona lena esikhathaza kakhulu la eSouth Africa noma eAfrika. I thank you.
Greetings. I will speak in my own language. It is now clear that we are all having the same challenge. When a capitalist or investor come, they use chiefs to dispossess Africans of their land. The government is promoting the chiefs. If you see people being evicted, there is a chief behind. Thank you.
Thank you for the translation. Any further questions from Durban before we move to Johannesburg? Okay, so let's move to Johannesburg. Over to you in Johannesburg. Can you see if there are any questions or comments?
Good morning, Ma Africa, or good afternoon, Ma Africa.
Okay,
sorry, was I?
Wait for that. Can we ask the presenters to respond to that observation. I know that early on we had two very interesting questions from East London as well, and now is the opportunity for our presenters who didn't get a chance to respond to do so as well. Okay, right. Okay, please go ahead, Njobek.
My first question is, what does the law of African courts say about the continuous dispossession of African people of their land, if ever there's a true meaning of an African court that protects Africans from being exploited and their rights being trampled on? Second question, does the certificate that the other presenter was talking about earlier on include grazing rights and water rights for women or for the people who are being issued with those kind of certificate? If the question then, the answer then comes to yes, can it also be asked if financial assistance from the bank can be provided for those particular women? And another question is, in most cases in farming, there's some struggles. Should the farmer or a woman who's a farmer woman who is facing challenges with financials, how are they going to be assisted? How is, or are they just going to be left so that their land should be repossessed by the bank? Thank you.
Dumela ma South Africa a matle. A bua mona ke mme Mamoleko. Ka pelo bohloko ka mokgwa e sala utlwa le maobane. Ke mohlolohadi. Hodima ke le mohlolohadi. Ke utlwa bohloko. Dikgosi tse o buang ka tsona. Mona rona ba toropong, dikgosi tsa rona ke makhanselara. Makhanselara ana a re hlwella hodimo. Mo ke dulang teng ke na le 29 years ha ke so fumane title deed ya ka. O la ba hlokafala. Ha hlokafala ba nkisa hodimo le tlase ba mpatla ntho tse ke sa di tsebeng. Jole ke batla ho tseba hore na ke tshwantse hore ke etse jwang. Ke tla ho ya bobedi. Ana makhanselara a lokela hore a laole mafatshe na? Ke batla ke potso ke batlang ho e botsa, makhanselara a laola mafatshe na? Hobane hona jwale tjena na ho na le ntho e la nkutlisa bohloko haholo. Makhanselara ana mafatshe ana a laolang ba rekisetsa batho ba nang le tjhelete e ngata mafatsheng mabitleng. Ha o ba jwetsa hore ke mabitla mo, hana taba o tshwere 2000 ka letsoho. Ntho e utlwisa bohloko. Ene hape sa bobedi, ha re lo batla mafatshe a rona, re fuwa di-food parcel. Na food parcel ke yona e lokileng. Food parcel kapa lefatshe na. Nna ha e sa lo tloha kgale mona la ntso ho ntso re fuwa ditjhelete. Ha ke batle tjhelete eo, ke batla lefatshe la ka. Ke mosadi ke tseba ho iketsetsa ka matsoho a ka mabedi, ke tseba ho itshebeletsa, ke tseba ho etsa ntho engwe le engwe. Mmuso ha ke batle 25,000. Ha ke batla lefatshe la bontate moholo ba rona. So hona jwale tjenana ntlo ya nyana yane ya lekorokoti ke fuweng ho thweng ke lefatshe la ka teng. Ke dutse hodima le ruo la ka. Ka tlasa yona ho na le metsi, ho na le mashala, ho na le di-mineral. Ha mafatshe mane di-mine thuthumela hore ntlo ka ya petso. Ka hosane ke tla fumana ho na le matshwatleile ruo la ka, empa ho hanuwa ka leruo la ka. Hela re mameleng le re mamedise, re batla ntho, re batla mafatshe a rona. Tsamayang le lo searcha hape mane, le ba bolelle hore re batla mafatshe a rona. Jwale re kgathetse, enough is enough.
afternoon. Just to make an indication, Mozambique does not have traditional leaders. This was created during the time when Samora Machel took over. However, the administrators are the ones behind the misuse of the land. Now, the second part is the formalization of the land rights to women. It is excellent, formalization. However, the empowerment of women should be followed by the necessary training along with the funding that should make sure that there is an element of progression on the side of women. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, please go ahead. Go ahead. Yes, please go ahead. I can see a question there. Yes.
Rabogajani Jonas. Qui serait pas la faramo qui whistle. Rokoperar musho o vele correspondence les chava daily mail ya ona. Hobane rokoja di puelo di vodile. Kiri o meleching kiri expiry le. Sorry, wala linjuleo. Kiri twileng bus. Pela rokoperar musho o vele morka wala lona kal jaji o vele media wa ona o kopana les chava. Hobane musadi ke ngwana wa chimu monna ke ngwana wa chimu ka sa ga shiga mosadi a tlhokofetse chimu hectare ba e tlogela ile ke monna o se sa go tlhofala monna hectare ya tlogelwa ke monna o ka baka leo a se ke rena ka setso ra gatelela mosadi ke chimu rena re bana ba chimu ka moka ka malapeng ka gore jalo ke re
For the question, what I would suggest we do now is to just give our presenters 1 minute each to respond to the core issues that have been raised, and then on the basis of that, we can then wrap up the session and go for lunch. As I said, I do apologize, we're running a little late, but I hope you can bear with us so we can wrap up the session. And thank you very much, Johannesburg, for the questions and also the ones from Durban. So I'm going to start with Judith first, and then I will ask Augustine, and I'll finish off with Philan and Chilombo. Judith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think my parting shots, but also in response to some of the questions that have been raised in regard to the sustainability, but also the bigger package of involving, women in this land administration and making sure that they help them, is governments moving forward, or whoever is responsible, whoever has the authority, is to, once these initiatives come on board, to try and contextualize those initiatives, because it is clear that these are borrowed concepts, and definitely we have to, as countries, think of what are those approaches that work best for us? What can we borrow from those approaches to be able to fit our situation, instead of simply, imposing these as they are on the communities where they are piloted. Also, when it comes to, the comprehensive, now I have the right to land, I have registered. So how do I access the market? How do I use this land? How does it resonate with the planning regulations in a particular country? All those are conversations that leaders, of course, using the bottom-up approach, need to understand need to think about critically for them to be able to develop solutions that really solve and address the community problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. Can I pause for a translation of what Judith has said? Thank you. Next, I'm going to ask Augustine to come in and try and keep it as short as you can, Augustine. We're running behind time.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Chair. What I'll talk about is that in relation to the African Union and other regional bodies, it is a network that I see that it has been established because the African, in the African context, if you look at the African Union, the chiefs are also there. And these chiefs that are dispossessing, they call them in their meetings, they have even platforms. So if the people do not stand up for their own right, it will be very, very difficult. And I like the way the NGOs are assisting the locals because these reforms are being supported by donors. And in relation to we understanding the position of women in patriarchal system, I ask that our people should look at it in a historical context because history will tell us the trajectory of changes that have occurred than for us to just always look at it in the post-colonial era where we have new customary tenure system, which you proposed in your 2019 work. Other than that, it will be very, very difficult for us to know how women were treated in the past and how they are treated presently. And I believe that with the support that we are getting from our local NGOs, we'll be able to go far from now. Thank you.
Thank you. We again pause for a moment to allow for that to be translated. Thank you. Thank you for the translation. And lastly, I'm going to move to Pilan and Chilombo. So maybe I should start with Chilombo and then Pilan, you can have the last word.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think I want to end with, you know, there are a lot of power struggles that are still going on within these formalization processes, and they translate to women further being excluded and being made vulnerable through these formalization processes. And what happens is that there's a selective registration process that we see both in Mozambique and Zambia. And so there was a question that was raised, I think, from Johannesburg about our common property resources also being registered. And so what we find is that because there's so much interest by traditional leaders and other administrators in common property resources, that type of land is not being registered. And so communities are being excluded and therefore cannot access that land going forward. And so I think it's important to interrogate the entire process and break down the nested interests in land and not just focus on the residential land and the fields that locals farm on, and look at it from a more holistic perspective than is currently being done. Thank you.
Thank you, Chilombo. And last word to Philani. And Philani, can you also address the question which was asked earlier on, which was, is this land titling giving people access to grazing and water rights as well, from your findings?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Chairperson. Yeah, first of all, I want to respond to the issue about the traditional leaders in Mozambique. I think one of the main arguments is that this kind of formalization is going to improve land governance and deepen democracy. But what you actually see happening on the ground is that there is an evident shift in terms of decision-making power from individuals, families, and communities to the state officials, working with private consultants and what you might term local big men, who are usually connected to the ruling party, which is Frelimo in this case. It's also replicated in Zimbabwe and during Edgar Lungu's time, also strikingly in Zambia. So even if you look at this sector of the neighborhood, who now has kind of more power, is even called the cock, which in the local lexicon, reflects masculinity. And they are traditional leaders in Mozambique, but they were not involved in terms of land administration. So I thought I should just clarify that. Then the specific question you asked me about whether titling is involving that. Yes, yes. According to the policy, the official policy position in Mozambique is that you can be able to register your common property resources. You can have your own community do it. So there's the individual do it, there's the community, there's also the investor do it. But what is happening on the ground clearly shows a disjuncture between policy and practice, because the state officials, mainly from the provincial services of geography and land registry, are actually prioritizing registering like residential land, and if you have got some kind of a field, arable land, and not common property resources. Hence the argument we're talking about that there could be, a hidden agenda to create a land bank for the investors, both external and domestic, and further marginalize the people who are poor. And lastly, I think the issue of consent, civil society activists, public intellectuals, I think we must all push for consent. I see a massive difference between consultation and consent, and also not to be roped into this kind of developmental models because there's a lot of money in it, then we think we're going to fix them technically. I think if we differ and we have enough empirical and on the ground experience, we must have enough academic courage and activist courage to challenge some of these development models, which are not going to be able to emancipate the poor, especially women. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you. I'll just give a moment again for this to be translated, and then we will wrap up the session. Thank you. I think what just remains for me then now is to just try and bring this session to a close. Thank you all for joining this very fascinating session, which is exploring some of the pathways out of the resource alienation that we have been talking about in South Africa. And again, we tried to interrogate this question: can formalization protect people from land alienation that's being induced by these market forces that we can see? But we can see from the case studies presented that it's not a magic bullet and needs only to be seen as part of general agrarian and other governance reforms in order for it to work. It is helpful in establishing entitlement, but does not on its own offer that type of protection from the markets that we can find in rural Africa at the moment. And we also need to recognize that whatever we do, because of the patriarchal nature of much of African society, any intervention like this will come with gender dimensions, and these need to be incorporated into any policy thinking that's taking place. And I liked Augustine's approach of saying the historicity of land titling can help to inform some of the decisions that we make today. And as we can see here, part of the problem was to do with the nature and authority of traditional chiefs. And whatever we can do, as long as we don't reform the nature of this institution so that it governs for everybody, we will always have the types of resource alienation issues that we're talking about. So thank you all for joining this panel. I know we are late for lunch, and I want us to stop here and look forward to seeing you all after lunch. Cien, any comments?
No, thank you.
Okay.
We'll
Any
start
instructions?
again at 2 p.m. We'll start again at 2 p.m. Parallel sessions the same way. Thank you.
Recording stopped.